Hello and welcome to the final lecture of the Fullerton College Prepress class. This is Professor Ben Hewitt, and we're going to take a look in several videos at the PIA's Prepress Training Systems Task 6.8 Review. So this is the capstone lecture. This is looking back at everything from both semesters of the class. Without further ado, let's dive in. The learning objectives here are pretty much that. This is a review of basically everything we've learned so far in the last 2 semesters. If you've only been with me 1 semester, don't worry. It's still worth looking at this, and it's still worth taking the other semester in detail. So, composition. Composition is a major work area. This is the creative part of designing. You might call it design, actually. Typically speaking, out here on the West, in the American West, you would find yourself calling this graphic design, not necessarily composition. This might be more of a back east kind of phrase, or maybe something more professional than I ever encountered in my career here. But and maybe we have simplified our language to accommodate working with more and more wide varieties of non-printing professionals as clients, that we now call this design. But basically, design is composition, or composition is design. And this is done by designers when possible, if you're lucky. And designers are artists who appreciate and understand the principles of graphic communications. Good design and good designers are informed by the knowledge of art, psychology, color management, and all the technical aspects of production. So they understand what their designs, what their compositions are going to have to go through, what processes are going to have to be involved in creating this and bringing it into the real world and delivering it into the hands of the client, and then from there into the hands of the recipients. What does it have to survive? What requirements are placed upon this composition before it even gets started? Speaking of, here's some considerations when you're thinking about what you're going to design. You want to think about what the format is, the style, the color, the paper to be used, the finishing and binding requirements, as well as any mailing requirements. Now, the format is, what is it? So the format says, is it a brochure? Is it a business card? Is it a book? Is it a catalog? Is it a billboard? That's format. Style? Well, don't ask me about style. That's a dad joke. Style is what it looks like, what fonts are used, what the general layout is. Is it one big image with some text below it? Is it too many images so it overwhelms the viewer of what you're looking at? What is the general look? That's the style. Color, both in the sense of the psychology of color. What do different colors motivate people to do when they look at them? And also in the what colors can be produced, what can be survive printing question as well, because color comes at you from 2 angles. The paper will matter based off of the finishing and binding and mailing requirements, but other things as well. With business cards, everyone's obsessed with getting them as thick as possible, so they're as durable as possible, but they just don't want them cheap, so they can just give them away. So thick business cards are great, but if you're printing things like religious texts, Bibles, and what do you call them, like dictionaries, then very, very thin paper with high opacity is important because you don't want those books to be too thick. Mailing requirements, or binding and finishing, we'll get there in a moment, does it need to be die cut? Does it need to be folded? Is it being stitched into a book? What's going to happen to this physically post-printing? And going a step beyond that is mailing requirements. If it's intended to be sent to people via the postal service, then you have questions of survivability. Like, is it going to be durable enough to make it through all these different hands, change hands, get put in bags, flown on planes, thrown into sorting facilities, mechanically and hand sorted, sent out by Jeep, by personal carrier to be shoved into mailboxes that the slot may or may not be big enough of. Those sorts of things, as well as the actual legal requirements that make postage more doable. If you follow the regulations of the post office, you can get steep discounts for sending quantities of mail that they don't have to deal with in the more difficult ways. The more you can handle the automation for them, the less it costs to mail something. So believe it or not, you can actually save half your mailing cost if you leave enough space for the address to be put in the right spot. You can save the same half your cost if you don't have anything too close to an edge, and if it prints a certain amount of straightness to the paper, And if your cuts are accurate to a certain point, you're actually saving money. So these are things you want to look at. Digital workstations, the different things that are the actual physical, the physical objects that are going to run the different softwares we need to do our job. We're looking at different components for desktop publishing that make this work. And they include input devices like scanners and cameras. They include a CPU, the actual central processing unit, the thinking brain of your computer. Output devices like presses, monitors, technically speaking, plate makers, all that sort of stuff, and storage and archiving. The ability to make DVDs and CDs, which is still relevant. Thank you very much. Flash drive output. How is it going to be saved? Digital files. In the old days, in my childhood even, things were all recorded analog. Things like LP records, the old vinyl, which everybody swears sounds better, as well as audio cassettes, which is the long stringy thing of a magnetic tape. That's what I grew up on. I'm from the audio cassette era. I remember winding those things up all the time and they got pulled loose into a thing and hoping it didn't wrinkle too much to play. Photographic negatives and slides. Again, that's with my childhood and growing up in a print family. My dad had carousel upon carousel upon carousel. That's the storage device, by the way, that holds slides, full of slides. And the slides weren't like vacation slides of me waving at the Grand Canyon, as much as I would have liked that. The slides were all print files saved as a physical slide. Because then you could take that slide, enlarge it, and use it as a photo negative to expose a plate. But now everything's done digitally, and that means it's all been converted into binary ones and zeros and burned onto DVDs, burned onto CDs. The images are scanned and saved onto computers, hard drives, flash drives, and it's all inside a computer. Files are bits and bytes. A byte is just 8 bits. Bits and bytes are just different quantities of information. And the amount of those things you have determines how much space it'll take on your computer to store it and to save it and to remember it. Here's some common types of files. There's software files. That's the actual application that does the job. Right now, I'm using Adobe Acrobat to look at these slides and share them with you. That's the application. Fonts, which are all the typefaces that you want to use. Those are also digital files. Application files. In this case, I would call them native files. Application files is like mycooldesign.ai, so you know it's an Illustrator file. That's an application file. And lastly, images. All your JPEGs, PNGs, TIFFs, GIFs. That's right, I said GIF. Get over it. GIFs if you must, if you really like peanut butter. Anyways, so those are your different types. Desktop publishing software. This is the stuff that makes digital prepress and what we do possible. So the different type of software categories involved in what we do. You have the operating system, typically Windows or Mac, but hey, Linux is still viable, especially because that's what Windows and Mac basically is now. You have image editing software, which is the facial tissue instead of Kleenex for saying Photoshop. Illustration software, again, that's your generic store brand name of, I don't know which one of them. Could it be Illustrator? Page layout software is things like InDesign and Quark Express. Adobe Acrobat is so singular that only it is its own category. Good job, Adobe. You've built a more or less uncopyable program. There's no generic Acrobat. There is only Acrobat. Preflight software, which takes a look at stuff to make sure there's no problems, other than the parts you have to eyeball, because some of it is still eyeballed. And imposition software, which helps you arrange your pages of your document into the right order and orientation so that after printing, folding, binding, stapling, trimming, it all shows up facing the right way in the right order. We're going to talk about workflows for a moment, which is the process of what we do. So if you're using PostScript, which is the older method, this is all but extinct now in most print shops. So in this one, you would select print. And that would mean in your program, you do say file print, and the file print would tell it to make PostScript. PostScript is a secret programming language that printers enjoy. It's a way of describing a page in a code. I mean, this is a computer code, not a secret spy code sense. In a computer code that digital printers and digital plate makers understand very well. And that then for modern systems, which prefer PDFs anyways, would get converted into a PDF. A PDF is just a version of PostScript, really, or it's derived from it. And then that gets sent to make the actual output thing. And the output happens on output devices like inkjet printers, plate setters, laser printers, more specific things than that. But when you go to a PDF, you save some steps and some time. When you go straight to PDF in something like InDesign, you would actually get to export your file instead of file print, and you would say save as PDF. And when it does that, it skips the step of making PostScript and reinterpreting it as a PDF. It just goes straight there. And as you know from the color management portions of the class and all these things, anytime you have to translate something, you lose something. If something is, pardon the movie title, lost in translation sometimes, or a lot of times. So the more times you have to convert a file from format to format, the more likely something is going to be lost. By minimizing the conversions and minimizing the amount of times you translate it, you maximize the consistency of the output to what the original intent was. Specifically, when you're talking about skipping the PostScript step, that specifically means that you're going to have smoother gradients, better transparency, and way better transparency effects like drop shadows if you're using them. Those things have difficulty when you go through a PostScript distiller rather than just making a PDF directly. Because remember, Adobe, who made InDesign, also made Adobe Acrobat, which is its singular only category by itself, and its only job is to make PDF. So by understanding and having developed PDF themselves, Adobe gave itself a backdoor to make them without all the other processes. So there's some form of the brain of Acrobat living inside InDesign as well. So when you tell it to export to PDF, it can actually generate an accurate PDF, maintaining a lot of complicated parts that otherwise get lost, and put them directly into the PDF. This saves time, saves energy. I mean, literally, it saves electricity by spending less time running computer processors to make it happen. And by minimizing the translations, you minimize the error. Fonts and faces. So a font family is a group of fonts that have the same basic design, but different versions of themselves. This is when you get things like regular or Roman, italic, bold, bold italic, semi-bold. Some of the ones like Helvetica Neue, I think I'm pronouncing that right, have like 17 variations where it's like thin, ultra thin, super thin. Oh my gosh, it's so thin. If you turn it sideways, you won't see it. Paper thin, wafer thin, all these different variations on the weights and amounts of boldness and semi-bold and black and extra condensed black. Those are all part of a font family. And they come from different places called foundries. Foundries create these types. Foundry comes from the old word of people who used to make molds of metal, which is how you used to make physical type. Foundry would be who would make type, because they'd have to be someone who could make a mold and pour molten lead into it for you. So places like Adobe, Linotype, ITC, you might recognize some of these names out there. On the right, we have a list of fonts. I don't know why they used Arial in here, except that it's common and rather popular, but it's kind of the store brand version of Helvetica, so I wouldn't use it. Baskerville, again, is a freebie out there for you. When you want to be taken seriously, when you want the reader to think you know what you're talking about and accept you as an authority on what you're saying, say it with Baskerville. When you're trying to teach kids to read, Century Schoolbook is a great choice. That's what all the old Dick and Jane and Learning to Read books are set in. Geneva, not my favorite, no offense, but in my family, we have a rule of you don't use fonts named after cities. Anyways, it's another knockoff of Helvetica / Futura, and Univers, which are the three triad of good humanists. The other ones are all wannabes. So those are the three. Arial and Geneva, I would really stay away from for the most part. Minion is okay, but mostly it's known nowadays as being the default font from InDesign. Times sends shivers up my spine, not because it's bad on its own, but because that's the one that has 1.5 million copies out there, because every single person making a font has always tried to make a Times at some point in their life, and they're all floating out there, and you're never quite sure on someone's computer which versions of Times you have. And if a computer makes the assumption that it's the same thing, you're gonna find out the hard way that that paragraph that you thought fit on the page no longer does, because the spacing's slightly different on the other person's version of the same font. We'll get into that again later, I'm sure. But that's my solemn warning about time. So that one sends up red flags for me. Well, that's about it for this first video. Stay tuned for a few more to finish us off strong. Thanks for listening.